well, why do you think Asian Americans are more successful than Puerto Ricans? It must be racism. It's like, well, no, there's like all these other like possible. And by the way, I'm not saying it's impossible that someone could say they're not bigoted against Jews, but they really are. I'm just saying, why are we jumping to that conclusion and pretending that you have a certainty that this person is a bigot?
So Dave Smith recently had Keith Knight on his podcast to talk about the so-called woke right. And fairness and disclosure, I know both of these guys well personally, and I really like some of the points they laid out to kind of expose the people that are using this term and kind of using really ambiguous language to describe what it is and how it can possibly fit just about any political movement. I think what it is the people that call others that are calling them that because of one particular criticism they have with what they think. And we can get into that in a second, but let's watch and let's react.
All right, so let's move over now to this term, the woke right. Now, I will say, I've mentioned this on the show before. I do think I was an early adopter of this term. I started using this like, I had made the point, I think substantially before October 7th. I think I remember saying this with friends, but I think I definitely remember at least there was one Ron DeSantis press conference that we covered on the show. There's got to be at least a couple years ago where he was just going off about anti-Semitism and protecting Jewish students and Jewish kids from dealing with anti-Semitism. And I was like, man, this was my first kind of like thing where I was like, isn't it interesting when the topic of Israel or Jews comes up that these crusaders against wokeism almost immediately borrow not just like their talking points, their entire set of analytical tools, if you can even call it that. But it's like the way we are going to talk about this is, this constant concept creep between legitimate criticism, bigotry, and violence. They all kind of get mixed together in one bag. Then we are going to, pretend that a group of people who are not marginalized or victimized in society are under this constant threat. We're going to invoke injustices in history to explain why we're going to have speech laws. We're going to have our own set of political correctness. I was like, everything about this just seems to be like the exact same thing. And then after October.
And safe space laws and statutes in universities. That's the quickest way to get conservatives to support that kind of thing, which they made fun of, when it was leftists in college worried about, being susceptible to white supremacists and things like that. Perfectly acceptable if you want to have, Jews that are afraid of people that are critics of Israel. I like to say this is like, if you want to see the red vote version of woke, just say something critical about Israel, anything, or US aid to Israel. Could be about, someone in the Israeli government you don't like, what Israel's policy in Gaza is, what their military strategy is, how much money is going to Israel, and you will see the red flavor of woke.
For something, it was just like obvious to me. This is their entire argument. It's all wokeism. And then a different group of people, I guess notably Konstantin Kisin, who I was just arguing with on Twitter, James Lindsay, who, full disclosure, I don't get along with very well. And some of these guys, they started using the term woke right to attack Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and Daryl Cooper and myself and some others. So what do we, at this point, I almost feel like the waters have been muddied a little bit, but what are your thoughts on the woke right? Who fits into that category and how would you assess it?
So I want to start with James Lindsay's definition on trigonometry, which he gave to Konstantin Kisin, which Kisin appeared to agree with. Here's what Lindsay says. There's the philosophical, deeper aspect. Why woke? What does it mean? woke up to a structural politics that marginalizes people like me, and we need to band together in solidarity. No enemies to the right in order to be able to create a powerful enough oppressed coalition to flip over the power structure by putting ourselves at the center and claiming power for ourselves. This is explicitly woke, having a critical consciousness about the way the world is organized. The reason that this is such a horrible definition, even though I do like James Lindsay to a very high degree, he's been on my show twice and him and I got along. But after reading this actually applies to quite literally every single political movement that I have come across, even researching books like The Origins of War, where there were people in these primitive societies who felt like they were getting a raw deal. They resisted. There's chapters of the Bible where it's like, these people thought that they were getting mistreated by this pharaoh, and they did, thus and so. They were trying to increase the amount of power they had in opposition to people over them. So I just don't see that this is a definition. It's like, well, people on the woke right believe that the sun is really hot. Okay, yes, they do, but that applies to everyone else, so it's not a unique definition.
Yeah, I think Keith and Dave are right here. Basically, it's just kind of ironic because even the classical liberal tradition that James Lindsay, claims to come from. And by the way, I respect James Lindsay quite a bit. I think he's actually really savvy about the foundations of communism and Marxism. And there's a lot of good things I think that he's done. But like Keith is saying, it just seems to apply to basically every ideology. So even classical liberalism, which again, I think James Lindsay kind of claims to come from, there was an oppressor and oppressed class. It's a different class struggle than how Marx saw it between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. In, classical liberal theory, it's, intrusive government that's robbing people of their rights. That's the true class war in the classical liberal strata. So I just think he's right here, Keith and Dave, that is.
What I'm looking for when it comes to the woke right is the woke concept of ignoring very plausible explanations and primarily focusing on the potential motives of the person presenting the evidence. So when I say the Jewish Chronicle released a document published by the Hamas media office called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, Our Narrative, and it basically says, we are opposing the Israeli government, the Zionist crime organization, I believe they call it, because of the blockade they've had on us since 2004, the crimes going back to the Ergon, Stern, and Haganah, which have killed not only Palestinians, but if you look at the SS Patria, even the original Zionist organizations were targeting Jews trying to flee Palestine because they wanted to say, the world is unsafe except for Israel. For us Jews, the world is unsafe except for Israel, so everyone has to come here. This was a guy named Zev Jabotinsky's plan in a paper called The Iron Wall, written, I want to say, in the 1920s. He wanted to say, the one thing we want is the one thing the Arabs don't want, Jewish immigration. That's what we got to focus on. So these groups were trying to do that. So this document from Hamas mentions that. They also mention the number of mowing of the lawn operations. They mention things like Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, where a number of Palestinians have been killed. They say, well, we're not subject to fair trials. If you look at the entire list, it's nothing about they don't obey the Quran, we hate the Talmud, we hate Hollywood, which is run by it's none of that. It's all criticisms of what the Zionist government has done to them. And all of these explanations are things we would obviously see as illegitimate if done to us, or even if they were done to another country. Israel gets a 20-year blockade on Gaza, but we say that even if China potentially threatens a blockade on Taiwan, we might have to go to nuclear war. So there are very plausible explanations for things, but the woke right, the Konstantin Kissins, the Douglas Murrays, the Ben Shapiros, completely ignore that and say, well, you must be an anti-Semite. We're saying, this issue in Ukraine, this war, according to the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, William Burns, is more or less taking place as a cause or result of NATO expansion. Just as we wouldn't allow Soviet missiles in Cuba, they're not going to allow NATO on their border. Wow, I can't believe you like Putin. Wow, you're against democracy. This is.
Yeah, that's the same dynamic. And one thing I want to make clear here, too, is if you're an American libertarian, it's almost certain that your libertarian heroes, or those that you really are influenced by, are disproportionately Jewish. I think that's something a lot of people don't know, because, you know, people like Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard and Friedrich von Hayek and many, many more are Jewish. And that is who we root in a lot of the basis for our ideology. So it's actually pretty difficult to be an anti-Semitic libertarian in many regards, because a lot of our integral heroes are Jewish and come from that tradition. But absolutely, Israel has a special carve out. Israel itself, the government, not the people, are a protected class.
Is just the typical emotional response. Even some time ago, if you said, you know, this mass murder campaign in Vietnam is unjustified and we shouldn't be conscripting soldiers to fight into it, well, you must be a servant of the communists. It's like, not necessarily at all. In fact, this could empower the communists because it makes the capitalist West look totally evil. Or if you say, you know, bin Laden said in a Harvard publication titled Al Qaeda in its own words, bin Laden said that 9/11 happened as a result of sanctions on Iraq in the 90s, support for Israel, especially in Lebanon and against the Palestinians, and occupation of the land of the two sanctuaries in Mecca and Medina. And to which the woke right will say things like, wow, you're saying we deserve 9/11? You're saying you hate America? Anytime you criticize a law, they say, oh, you must hate the cops. You must hate the country that you live in. So it's all boring and predictable. And this is what I'm saying is the key to wokeness, ignoring very plausible explanations and replacing them with questioning the motives. And we can get into the Kissen issue specifically later if you want to specify that.
Well, I just want to, you know, it's funny because I've talked about this issue before, and I think you've honed in on something that I wasn't exactly precisely maybe as focused on as I should be. But even as you're saying it to me, you know, it's like, okay, so first off, let me just say, like, look, I completely agree with you. This is what I said about it at the time. The James Lindsay, and forget whatever me and him have insulted each other on Twitter, but I have thick skin. I could let that go and we could grab a beer tomorrow. Like, I don't really care. It's just, look, objectively, I'm looking at the argument, and his definition, like you said, it fits every political group. It's like awoken to a structure that was unfair to us, and so we want to get together and put ourselves in power. Like what? That's politics. That's literally what all of it is. It's you might be like, well, you see, what makes them the woke right is that they want to run candidates for office, and their plan is to raise money and garner votes in order to put themselves in a position of power where they can implement policies that they deem as preferable. Like, yeah, that's all. And then I see this just like the way the tactics are used. It's like you have this very broad definition. You say the players are Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and Daryl Cooper, and then all of a sudden you see them start bringing up like Nick Fuentes or someone else, and then using that as proof that these other guys are woke right, even though like there's a huge gap between the views of this group and the views of that group, and it's just it's all incoherent to me.
Yeah, this is a fair point. Based on that definition that Keith read earlier, which was an exact quote from James Lindsay on Trigonometry about what he considers it, it really does seem to apply to every political movement or kind of faction that's trying to kind of confront issues they think are wrong in the world and place themselves at the center of it, as James kind of said, and kind of overturn that power structure. Again, it applies almost universally. I'd like to know the political movement that doesn't embrace that. Because as Dave Smith says here, it's basically just politics.
And I will say, much like when you're dealing with the woke left, it's like, look, the claim is not that bigotry doesn't exist or that bigotry couldn't possibly be the reason for something happening. Like, it is not impossible that Derek Chauvin could have just been looking for a black guy to kneel on his neck and happened to find George Floyd. But the argument we're making is like, you have to present some type of evidence for that before I'm just going to believe it for no reason. And so let's look at the evidence, and let's also consider what could be alternative or more likely, you know, answers to this question. As you mentioned, like, okay, these police have these enormous amount of powers and they can wield them with impunity. That seems like a plot. And so I've found myself, as I'm arguing this the other day, even as you're saying it, I'm like thinking about this before even the Constantine argument, where there are these people. So Ian Carroll Are you familiar with Ian? Yeah. So he just went on Joe Rogan's show a few days ago. This created quite a stir. And I'm like arguing with people, and they're like, well, look, clearly he hates Jews because look, he's got all these conspiracies where at the top of the conspiracies are the Israelis. And by the way, he's put out some things that like I'm not at all sold on Israel did 9/11, and it certainly wouldn't like really conflict with my worldview if that was the case. It's not like I've seen the evidence. It's like, actually, I don't think it's as strong.
The dancing Israelis is constantly brought up by this crowd, but I'm with Dave on this one.
As you guys think, the major pieces of evidence I seem to say are what's dubbed the dancing Israelis, which they weren't actually dancing, but that's what they've come to be known. Right. I thought Max Blumenthal's piece on that pretty much let you know, like, it's just not really that strong of an argument. There's a bit of a like, there, but not really. We don't really know that this was any proof that
I totally agree with him too. Love Max Blumenthal, and there's no fiercer critic of Israel than Max Blumenthal. But he gave this subject a really interesting treatment. I highly recommend that.
That Silverstein got a big insurance policy on the World Trade Center. The issue, Netanyahu said something about the World Trade Center coming down. The problem is, I think it might be an age thing sometimes. Sometimes like I think a 27-year-old looks at that and goes, no one could have possibly known that the World Trade Center would have been a terrorist target before 9/11. The problem is that the same guys had tried to knock down the Trade Center in 93. It was the most high-profile target for terrorism in the world. It wasn't that crazy of a thought to mention the Twin Towers coming down when it had already been attempted. And I'm just saying, I look at it and I objectively go, I don't actually think you have as strong a case. Certainly not a strong enough case that I would be comfortable like I am with other being like, this is what happened here. Okay.
So here was Ian Carroll's primary crime on Joe Rogan. Number one, he was critical of Israel. That's enough for some people to call him woke right. But he also had the nerve to say, and correctly so, that Netanyahu propped up Hamas because he saw it as a force that would destabilize the Palestinians and make it impossible to establish politically a Palestinian state. And he said that that's true. That's been covered in the Times of Israel, Haaretz, and many other Israeli publications. In fact, Israelis know this, and Netanyahu's taken some political flack for it. But he had the nerve to say that on Rogan. And what do kind of the mainstream Zionists say? Well, that's a conspiracy. That's what they say.
Okay, like we can say this definitively. I just don't feel that way about it. Okay, but that being said, so I could disagree with this take and someone else could have a theory that they think Israel was behind 9/11. I could disagree with them. But to conclude from that you must hate Jewish people, it's like, well, wait a minute. There's all these other possible like reasons why you might think that. Number one, maybe you were just more persuaded by the evidence than I was. Maybe you've seen some evidence that I haven't seen yet. Maybe you've seen the same evidence and you just weren't quite as scrupulous as I was of being like, nope, I have a higher bar of what meets the I believe this actually happened test. Maybe the reason why so many people are interested in conspiracy theories these days is because there's been so many real ones and the government lies to you about everything.
The last 4 years is the last 4 years of conspiracy theories coming to fruition. There's no doubt about that.
Just lived through the country being shut down over a bullshit conspiracy. So maybe people are more open to them. And maybe the reason why people are suspicious of Israel is because, well, I don't know, we're currently, funding and arming a war for them that is not at all in our national interest. We've fought, like all of these wars in this region of the world, clearly taking out one enemy of Israel after the other, and people start to get, it's just, there are so many other explanations that are so much more likely. And then when you couple that with the fact that this Ian Carroll guy goes on Rogan and like 12 times disclaims, I'm not saying it's the Jews. I got nothing against Jews. Jews are regular people just like me and you, man, and I'm cool with you. I got no problem.
He did. He said that so many times in that podcast. I listened to the whole thing, but that's just, deliberately omitted from any of these narratives calling Ian Carroll an anti-Semite. It's so ridiculous because, again, just like a lot of the leftists in the corporate media, they care much more about the narrative and how they want to drive things than the actual truth. But I side with truth in that battle.
I'm saying it's this small group of people. I think, like, when you couple it all together, it's the same. It's literally the same thing as going like, well, why do you think Asian Americans are more successful than Puerto Ricans? It must be racism. It's like, well, no, there's like all these other like possible. And by the way, I'm not saying it's impossible that someone could say they're not bigoted against Jews, but they really are. I'm just saying, why are we jumping to that conclusion and pretending that you have a certainty that this person is a bigot?
It seems to me the common factor uniting all the people that the James Lindsay and Konstantin Kiesens of the world are calling woke right is that they're just plain old critics of Israel. It's not that they're anti-Semitic from what I've seen. In fact, some of the people that they've branded as such are people that have recently been on the right and kind of turned to a more anti-Israel and especially the anti-the deeds of Israel perspective. People like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, and now Ian Carroll, who recognize that the entangling alliance with the US and Israel has been a dangerous one. That it's essentially bankrupted the country, that the U.S. doesn't really get much out of it, that, as Dave Smith said, it just seems like the U.S. has taken out enemy after enemy after enemy of Israel. And what's so crazy and ironic about this whole thing is so many people on the right understand this when it comes to Ukraine and the entangling alliance, the destructive entangling alliance that one represents. But they don't apply the same lessons to Israel. It's not necessarily that they're anti-Semitic. There's many critics of Israel that are genuine in their thoughts about why non-interventionist foreign policy is the right direction, the right approach. I think Ron Paul was completely right about that. And to throw them all in that box, it really is kind of wielding the same tactics as what the woke left did when it comes to, oppressor groups. They say that, people are vulnerable on college campuses. We can't have them exposed to these dangerous ideas. The same thing is happening when it comes to right-wingers, deeming critics of Israel the woke right. But I want to hear from you guys. Let me know in a comment below. Do you agree more with James Lindsay and Konstantin Kiesens about this issue when it comes to the woke right? Or are you on team Dave Smith and Keith Knight? I want to hear from you. Let me know below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. And as we always say here, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.